Today is January 15th, 2001, and I'm Carla Singer, and we're here in celebration of my dad, Leonard Michalove's 75th birthday, which we celebrated with a big surprise brunch on last Sunday, attended by his children, his grandchildren, relatives, and friends. And in honor of this special landmark birthday, our gift to him, to ourselves, and to our children is this tape about his life.
Hi, I'm Zach Singer, and I'm one of those children to whom this is a gift, and this video will help Granddaddy live on forever and teach his following generations about him and his life.
And I'm Lenny Michalove. I was born in Asheville, North Carolina, January 9th, 1926, and I'm told in a raging snowstorm in the Mission Hospital in Asheville. Now, this is a very early picture of me and my mother. As you can see, I was quite chubby, and I have remained so till this day.
So tell us about your parents and how they came to be in Asheville, North Carolina.
Well, my mother name was Jean Adelstein Michalove. She was born in Atlanta. She married my father, who had come to Asheville, North Carolina as a very small child and lived there a good part of his life up until that date.
So after they were married, they settled?
After they were married, they lived in Asheville, North Carolina. My mother's father had died when she was quite a young girl, and her mother also became very sick with the Spanish flu, which was very virulent in the period around 1918 to 1920 in the southeastern United States. There were many deaths and many people who were seriously mentally disturbed because of the very high fevers associated.
And what did your parents do for a living while in Asheville?
Well, my father was in the retail business, had a dress shop. Through that period, they got married, I think, in 1924, and that was during a rather boom time in the mountains of North Carolina. They used to send people who had TB, or tuberculosis. They thought the mountain air was a curative for it, and there were sanitariums all through the mountains, and there were a lot of people who would come into the mountains. And it's the same time that the Vanderbilt family was building their huge mansion in Asheville and brought in and built a whole neighborhood of their friends to come for summer home. So it was a very fashionable area up until 1929 when everybody lost all their money.
Did you have any brothers or sisters? And what was your relationship with them? How was that?
Well, I have one younger brother who is 7 years younger than I am. I went to the Air Force when I was 18 and he was 11, so we didn't have a whole lot of relationship. He was quite young during the period that I was an adolescent, like your age, Zach. He was only 7 years old, so we didn't have a lot in common in those days. But in later years, we've grown closer together, get to know each other.
Okay.
You said that your mother was Jean Adelstein, and she was born in Atlanta. But tell us a little bit about your father, his full name, and what his background
My
is.
father's name was Sam, or Samuel Michalove, and his father, whose name was Louis or Laser immigrated to the United States because he had an older brother that had settled in Asheville, and he gradually had brought all of his siblings over, and my grandfather was, I think, the third of the brothers to come to America and to come to Asheville. And my father and his sister and older brother were all born in the Ukraine before they came to the United States, and they had one more child, a younger son, whose name was Bill Michalove, who was named after Wolfe, who had died before he was born. And I was born in Asheville. The family was very heavily involved in Asheville. There were, I think, 4 brothers and 3 sisters at one time, all living in Asheville. They were quite remarkable people. My grandfather, of course, came here not speaking a word of English and got fitted out with a peddler's pack and went hiking through the mountains, peddling housewares and trinkets and what have you in the rural areas of the mountains of North Carolina until he accumulated enough capital to open a store in Asheville. They were very courageous people.
Did you grow up in this kind of extended family with aunts and uncles and cousins?
Well, to some extent. Unfortunately, most of my father's siblings had moved out of Asheville before I was old enough to really know them. My father's oldest brother, whose name was Jack or Jacob, was living in Forest City, North Carolina at that time, which was only 60 miles, but a very tough 60 miles through the mountain. And so we did visit them when I was a young child, and they had a son almost exactly my age, and they would visit with us sometimes, but it was a pretty tough trip, and I think I got car sick every time we went through those mountains to go to Forest City.
What can you tell us about your parents, like when you think about your mother and your father?
Well, my mother was an only child. She had lived a rather sheltered life. She grew up in Piedmont, Alabama, and went to high school in Piedmont, and was quite a bright woman. But I guess in thinking back, because she was an only child, she was somewhat spoiled, and when things didn't go her way, she became very despondent about it. She felt like everything should go her way. And my father was a very charming man with a whole lot of personality. It was always amazing to me that anybody he ever knew would remember him. I can remember one of my very early trips to New York, walking down the street with him and somebody hailing him, and they discussed the fact that they hadn't seen each other in 35 years. I'm thinking to myself, in those days when I was probably 20 years old, 22 years old, nobody could remember anybody from 35 years ago. But I still remember my wife of 51 years.
I haven't forgotten her yet. So, were you closer with one of your parents than the other one?
Well, my father, after the Depression in 1929, lost his business. He'd made some bad real estate investments. There were such boom times going on around Asheville, and they were putting together this big mixed-use type thing in Black Mountain, and they were only about 40 or 50 years too soon in doing this. And when the Depression hit, all that was wiped out, and he lost his business, and he went on the road as a salesman. So a good part of my growing up days, my father was out of town during the weeks. Mm-hmm. And my time was more with my mother during that period than with my father.
Do you remember missing him or wishing he was there more?
No, I don't really remember, Carla. It's a long time ago,
Mm-hmm.
and those kind of impressions you lose. We had a good relationship. My father was a very likable, warm person, and we did have a good relationship. This picture that we're looking at now is my great-grandfather and great-grandmother. His name was Wolf, and her name was Minnie. And after most of his family had immigrated to the United States, his wife had died, and he came on a visit to Asheville. And he actually died in Asheville and is buried in the Michalove section of the cemetery, the Riverside Cemetery in Asheville. There was 3 Bill Michaloves were named after him, and 2 Phil Michaloves. So that he was quite a patriarch to the family. I never knew him, of course. He died long before I came along. He was 21 years old at the time they did the 1858 census in Ukraine.
And she was buried in Ukraine, in the old country.
Yes. To my knowledge, she never got to this country at all. And their oldest son's name was S.H., and he was the one that came to the United States first, and he was a rabbi in Shepherd. And he originally went to Knoxville, Tennessee, and had a small congregation there. But he didn't like Knoxville, or they didn't like him, as happens frequently with rabbis. And he moved across the mountain to Asheville and was the shepherd in that Jewish community, and opened a very fancy houseware store called the IXL store. And they handled all the fine china and decorative things in silver and all that type of thing. It was a big 3-story building on Haywood Street. And he was kind of the patriarch in the family, and he was the one that arranged to bring his siblings to this country.
So just in case Zach or someone else listening to this tape doesn't know what a sheket was, do you want to tell us what that is?
Well, a shepherd did the ritual slaughter. Primarily, of course, he came to various people's houses because everybody had chickens in their backyard in those days, and he would come and he would kill the chickens. And if he also would go to the stockyards and kill cows that they'd use for meat, so they'd be kosher, and he would do it in the prescribed fashion. The picture we're looking at now is a picture of my grandfather, Louis or Laser Michalove, and my grandmother, Hannah Michalove, and my father and his siblings. And from left to right is Bill, who was the youngest son, and then Jack is standing right between his parents, who was the oldest son. My father, who was next in line age-wise, is standing just to the right of his father, and Sister Ann is at the end.
So what do you remember about any of the folks in this picture?
Well, of course, I remember my grandparents quite well, because my grandfather, I lived until I must have been about 20 years old. I was in the Air Force and stationed on the West Coast at the time of his death, and I came home. But of course, coming on a train, I didn't make the funeral. But I had spent a lot of time with him over the years. He was really a very charming kind of a man, a real warm, outgoing personality. At that time, he had a store in Asheville, and my first gainful employment, I worked for him on Saturdays. And in front of the store, you had a table full of men's socks, which we sold for 5 cents a pair. And I was in charge of running that department and collecting the nickels that the people came by would buy a pair of socks.
Starting at what age?
Oh, I must have been all of 7 or 8. And I think I got a quarter for working from about 9 in the morning till about 7 in the evening. And that was pretty good in those days, because with that quarter I could go to the movies, I could buy a big box of popcorn and a candy bar, all for at 25 cents.
And what about your grandmother?
My grandmother was a real homemaker, and her house was always full of people visiting, any stragglers or strangers that got into Asheville and needed a place to stay or a place to have a meal would always end up at my grandmother's house. And you never knew when you went there who you're going to run into at my grandmother's house. She was a good cook. She loved to cook. She made wine. They used to have barrels in the basement under their house, aging. And, but of course, they were only for religious purposes, of course.
Now, was this hospitality just to Jews who came to Asheville, or?
Well, my association is with Jews. My grandfather was one of the founders of the shul in Asheville, and they lived just down the street. Their house was maybe a half a block down the hill from the shul. And one of the strangest experiences I had when I was about 10 on a Friday night, we didn't have a minyan, and I was there with my grandfather. My grandfather says to me, "Go out and grab the next man that comes on and tell him we need him." So I went out and I invited this man to come in. Wasn't anybody I knew. And when we got all through with the service, he says, "You know, I've always wondered what kind of service you Jews had." The picture we're looking at now is my mother's mother. Her name was Mary Adelstein. Her maiden name was Cohen. She was one of 3 Cohen sisters that were born in Rochester, New York. And interestingly enough, all ended up in Atlanta. And Carl, I'm sure you remember Aunt Eva. Aunt Eva Gordon was my grandmother's sister. There was the other sister's name was Sarah, and she was married to Philip Elson, who was president of the AA synagogue in 1900.
Wow. And I was just telling you that I remember seeing, my memory as a 6-year-old was of your grandmother coming.
But that was my father's mother.
On the other side. Okay.
This lady, I'm sure, had died long before that.
Uh-huh. Okay.
The picture we're looking at here is a picture of my mother and her cousin, Elaine Elson. Carla, you may remember Elaine, Fanny Badge. They were sisters. They had an older brother whose name was Aaron Elson. They were Philip and Sarah Elson's children, and my mother's first cousins. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was struck down during the Spanish flu epidemic during or right after World War I, and she ran an extremely high fever, and it destroyed her reasoning ability, and her mental age, I think, was probably around 10 or 11 after she recovered from this. And her husband, Isidore, died during this same epidemic. It was a really virulent thing, and there were thousands of deaths. It was a major epidemic in this country, the Spanish flu. And consequently, my mother grew up very much with her cousins. And Aunt Sarah and Aunt Eva were surrogate mothers to her during this period.
And you said you remember going to visit family in Rochester.
Yes, one time we went to visit family in Rochester, and we had cousins whose name was Feinstone in Buffalo, and then cousins whose name was Berger in Rochester. The Rochester part of the family were real estate people and developers. Of course, during the Depression, things were not so swift in either of those businesses. But the cousins in Buffalo had a very thriving cigar store, and they had a room in the back with about 15 telephones that they were busy accepting wagers. And
they were bookies.
They were bookies. There were 2 brothers, and somewhere about, I guess shortly after the war, the mafia invited them to sell out their business and maybe relocate somewhere, and they moved to Florida, the brothers and their children and family.
So do you have any cousins remaining in Rochester now?
Well, the last I heard, I had one cousin who was still living there. Her name was June, and I haven't seen or heard of her in years. The Feinstones had a daughter that married a fellow named Eplin and lived here in Atlanta until both their deaths.
So when you went up to visit in Rochester, how did you travel there? That was
Oh, we drove by car. We drove to Buffalo to Buffalo first, and then to Rochester.
Did you remember how long that would take?
No, I'm sure it was 3-4 days. The picture we're looking at now is my mother, probably at the age of about 6 or 7, holding her favorite doll and dressed in the fashion of its day, as we were like little girls dressed, with crinoline petticoats and their hair all fixed beautifully, and kind of what we did to our 3 girls in the days that how they looked was important to everybody.
As this picture shows, your family seems to have worn very nice clothes and had high economic standing and a good standard of living. Can you tell us something about that?
Well, as I understand it, my grandfather, Isidore Adelstein, had a very successful store in Piedmont, Alabama. Of course, that was long before the Space Center in Huntsville, which is very close to Piedmont. But apparently it was a prosperous area. Even then, was primarily agricultural, and apparently he had a very successful store, because despite his long illness and his wife's long illness, there was a substantial estate left to my mother. They owned some property in Atlanta, some rental property, which they maintained up until probably the middle 30s, when the Depression just forced them to have to dispose of it, and was a terrible turn to the worse economically for everybody, beginning in late 1929, and we didn't really ever recover from that Depression until World War II. The thing we're looking at now is a copy of my mother's valedictorian speech when she graduated from high school in Piedmont, Alabama in the early 1920s. What I was going to do, Carla, to give you an idea of how my mother thought, just read you a little brief part of her valedictorian address, and it really brings out her feeling of being part of the environment that she lived in. And in here she says, being true to Southern instincts, we were content in the past that we were not to project ourselves on the world, but it's now time that the South should show the universe the wealth of her literature, so that she may be given the high place so richly deserved. And she goes on and speaks about liberty in this country was really begun in Virginia in 1620 in Jamestown. And she truly felt she was a Southerner, and she had great affection and respect for the Southern heritage. I never heard her expound on the Civil War or what have you, as far as that's concerned, but she really was proud to be a Southerner.
How about you? How do you feel about being a Southerner?
Oh, I think I definitely have strong feelings about being a Southerner. I think there are many of the refinements that have gotten lost over the years that made life in the South so much more pleasant, and people's approach to each other so much more pleasant. It was a courtesy, a welcome of different opinions and feelings without any criticism or passion, acceptance of other people's approach and beliefs. That we somewhat lost now. People are going to become such advocates, and their way is the only way. And it just isn't so. There are many ways for people to achieve happiness and to achieve success, both financially and spiritually and within their lives.
Do you think that that has something to do with migration to the South from other places, or do you have a theory about why that change has taken place in your lifetime?
Oh, I think probably some of it is migration, but more it's the media, radio and television. Today, as you travel in this country, you get off an airplane in a city, and unless you see a sign that says what city it is, you see the same stores presented the same way, showing the same merchandise, no matter where you are. The areas have lost their distinctive feeling. Atlanta no longer looks like a southern town. It looks like any other big city. We have these canyons and high buildings, and it's just disappeared as far as the city is concerned. And that's evolution.
Did you, when you were growing up and going to school in Asheville, do you remember doing anything that was particularly Southern in school? Like, we have a big debate now about the flag of Georgia. Do you remember any kind of peculiar
I
Southern
don't
thing?
remember in North Carolina having any large conversation about flags and what have you. The statue in the square in Asheville was to the then who was to the man that was governor of North Carolina during the Civil War. There was a big debate within that state as to whether they were going to become part of the Confederacy or stick with the Union. It was a state of great differences. The mountain area was so completely different than was the plains area and the seacoast area, the flat area. And there were very distinct differences, both politically and philosophically, and the way people lived in those areas. And I don't remember anything other than the fact that school was out on Confederate Memorial Day.
So what else do you remember about school in the early years?
Well, of course, I went to elementary school in Asheville. The school is still there. The last time we rode down Merriman Avenue, Claxton School, the big granite building, is still there and still in use. People are still going to school there. I do remember that we had very strict teachers, but we also had a very good time. It was easy world. I can remember riding my bicycle to school, riding up the hill. It was very hard going to school because it was straight up the hill, but coming home I could fly. And of course, I remember the big snows we used to get in the wintertime. We lived down the hill from the Asheville Country Club golf course, and that was an ideal place to take a sled. And they did close off streets in Asheville, some of the hilly streets, closed them off and built bonfires. Everybody could go out with their sleds. They even put up floodlights sometimes at night so you could see. And we made great use of the winter sports. Of course, we didn't have any ice skating, but nobody could afford skates anyhow.
How about skis?
No. There was no skiing to my knowledge in the mountains at that time, in North Carolina mountains.
So as you began to approach junior high school and bar mitzvah age. Can you tell us about that transition in your life and how you prepared for your bar mitzvah?
Well, of course, it was a small community. We belonged to the Reformed congregation in Asheville. My grandparents belonged to the, well, I guess it would be conservative or Orthodox shul there. And being a small community, we had religious school jointly with the two congregations, had them together. But to prepare for bar mitzvah, the rabbi actively prepared us or worked with us. And we had a young rabbi, as most small congregations had in those days, I suppose. And he and I played a lot of tennis. We learned just enough Hebrew for me to memorize the prayers I had to say in my Torah portion. And I really never could read any Hebrew, but it did help my forehand a lot in preparation for bar mitzvah.
What's your Hebrew name? So when you had your bar mitzvah and you were called to the Torah, what did they call you?
Leib.
Leib ben Shmuel?
Ben Shmuel.
Growing up and going to elementary school through junior high and even into high school, did you feel like you were different, or did your peers make you feel different because of your Judaism at all?
Zach, other than maybe one incident when I was playing football for my junior high school, and some guy on the other side of the line was trying to get me rattled, I didn't ever have any inclination or indication of any anti-Semitism. I was well accepted. I, in junior high school, was a member of DMLA, which is a Masonic youth organization. When I moved to Atlanta and they found out I'd been a member of DMLA, my Jewish friends said they didn't take any Jews in DMLA. Well, they didn't, maybe in Atlanta, but we did in Asheville. No, I did not have any feeling of being discriminated against or rejected because I was Jewish. And there were so many of my family. The family was well known in the town. Everybody knew we were Jewish. It was it wasn't a secret.
So at what point did you move to Atlanta?
In 1940, we moved to Atlanta, and part of the move, in June, my mother and my brother Henry and I went to Miami Beach and stayed in a hotel at 14th and Ocean Boulevard, for which we had one large room with 3 beds, and we got continental breakfast for the princely sum of $5 a week. And fortunately, because of that move, in those days, Atlanta people came to Miami Beach in the summertime. You just couldn't go anywhere on a vacation as cheaply as you could go to Miami Beach. So I had the opportunity to meet a lot of people there, so that by the time I got to Atlanta, I had a lot of friends. It made the whole transition move so much easier because of that.
And what grade were you in at that point?
Well, I just finished 8th grade at the junior high, but when I came to Atlanta, I was able somehow to con the people at Boys High School that I had finished 2 years of high school and only needed 2 more years to graduate. And somehow I did that. I'm not sure how exactly, but I did. And I didn't have any trouble keeping up. My grades were good.
So you spent 2 years at Boys High, and that was your whole high school career?
Right. And I was 15 when I graduated from Boys High.
Where'd you go following Boys High?
Well, when I got out of Boys High, I worked, I guess 3, 4, 5 months. And then I went to Emory, and I spent a year at Emory prior to becoming, I guess till I was about 17 and a half, and I got tired of going to school, and all my friends were in service, and nobody really had their mind on school. The war was on, And I was already a member of the Air Force Reserve, and I had enlisted in the Army Air Force before, about the time I was 17, and was on a reserve status and didn't have to go into service till 3 weeks after my 18th birthday. But that was a very strange area, a period of time in this country. We were embroiled in a war that, frankly, we were losing initially. We were so ill prepared. I can remember when Pearl Harbor Day happened, the oldest of my friends and was the first one to be drafted was Jerry Sobelson, and Jerry was home on a furlough after completing his basic training, and we were having a poker game at his family's house, and somebody called and said, "Turn on the radio. The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor." A few things that you remember all your life, where you were when something happened, and that, of course, was a major thing, and they called all the servicemen that were on leaves or furloughs to return to their bases, and Jerry left immediately, and we took him to the bus station. He went back to some base in Alabama that he was stationed at. Un momento, por favor. Zach, this is a picture of my mother. She must have been about, 18 or 19 in this picture, probably shortly before she and my father were married. Zach, of course, this picture was much later. I would think my mother probably was in her early 40s in this picture. And I would suspect we were living in Asheville, or we may have already moved to Atlanta at this stage. I'm really not sure. And this is a picture of my father, Sam Michalove, and I think he probably was about 17 or 18 in this picture. He was wearing a Norfolk jacket. When I got out of service, one of the first articles of apparel that I bought was a Norfolk jacket. I had never seen this picture of him at that time, and he dug it out to show me I wasn't so fashionable. He'd had one of those as a young boy. Well, Diana, our family cat, who really runs the house and whom we are here to serve, just came in and voiced her objection to all this filming that's going on, but she's now gone to have her dinner, so she shouldn't bother us again. This picture is taken of my father when I was probably 5 or 6 years old, and it was taken at a swimming pool in Asheville called Royal Pines, which was one of our favorite Sunday activities, was to go to Royal Pines. My father was somewhat formal in those days. He was a very dapper dresser and always dressed very fashionable things, and I rarely saw him in sports clothes or sports shirts until many years after, until the time I was really almost a grown man, that he finally decided you didn't have to wear a coat and tie all the time. This picture is taken of my father at, I would guess, at about age 25. And as you can see, he was very dapper and very well dressed. I can remember as a young boy in the wintertime, my father would always have a starch collar and tie. He very often wore spats, which was very 1920-ish, early 30s. Generally wore a hat when he went out. Was always well dressed. Took a great deal of pride in his appearance. But he also was a sports fan. And one of my earliest memories of spending time with him, he and I would go to baseball games. And as a matter of fact, he tried to convince me one time when we went to a doubleheader that we might as well go home after the first game. They weren't going to have any refreshments in the second game.
What baseball team did you go to watch?
Well, we went to watch the Asheville Tourists. That was a Class B team, was a farm team for the St. Louis Cardinals. And St. Louis Cardinals in those days were the most powerful team in baseball with Dizzy Dean and Joe Medwick, really people who are in the Hall of Fame. And they used to come through from spring training as they went north before the season started. They train in Florida, and as they went north, they do exhibitions. And I saw exhibitions of all these famous players for the St. Louis Cardinals, and then some of the young fellows that came along that became famous players later. And this is a picture of my father and I when I was 17 months old and quite chubby. And I think this probably was taken at Beaver Lake, which was a swimming pool that had a beach built into it, built beside the pool. And I think that's where it was. You should see, though, my father was not in a bathing suit. And I don't ever remember seeing him in a bathing suit until much, much later in life.
So who was it who taught you to swim?
My mother taught me to swim, and at such an early age that I frankly cannot remember not knowing how to swim. I always knew how to swim. This picture is a picture of my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, holding me, and beside her is her sister, Aunt Eva Gordon. And if you look at them, you can see a very strong family resemblance. And frankly, Aunt Sarah, who was older than either of them, looked very much the same. They really were very similar in appearance.
Did you spend like Jewish holidays with them, or did
Well,
they?
when we lived in Asheville, we always, with my grandmother's for Passover, and there usually would be 30 or 40 people there. And my grandfather could read Hebrew faster than anybody I ever knew till I married your mother and I met Uncle Lou. And Lou Mays was by far the champion speed reader of Hebrew. This picture is of me when I was about 2 years old. And of course, my father was a natty dresser, and he saw to it that I had very fashionable clothes too at that age. Zach, you see, you were not the first person in our family to have pretty wild, curly hair. Hang on to it and enjoy it. You're going to end up like the rest of us one of these days, I hope. And I'm still back in the swimming pool. I spent most of my summers as a young boy in swimming pools. I can remember that when I was about maybe 10 years old, came summertime. In the morning had a lunch packed. I got on my bicycle and rode up to the Asheville Country Club swimming pool and spent the day there. The tennis court was right next door. It was in the middle of the golf course. And we weren't members of that country club, but nobody was paying their dues during the Depression anyhow, so I was never questioned. I could have been a member there because I sure took advantage of all the facilities. And that's now the golf course at Grove Park Inn in Asheville. At that time, it was the Asheville Country Club. The golf course was. Grove Park Inn was already there. This house we lived in probably to the time I was about maybe 7 or 8 years old, because I remember my brother Henry was born after we moved away from this house into a house on Farwood, which was at the foot of the hill from Grove Park Inn and the Asheville Country Club. I don't really remember much about this house, but we have some pictures of me in my cowboy suit and the steps there. And I guess David comes natural by his interest in cowboy outfits.
Where was this house?
Well, it was in Asheville, and it was out towards Beaver Lake, but it wasn't at Beaver Lake.
Do you remember the street?
I remember the street was Mount Vernon, but I don't remember the street number. In my memory, it was a very large house, but the last time I went by there, it must have shrunk. somehow your mind plays tricks on you about those kind of things. Although the house on Farwood that we lived in, I remembered being a large house, and it is a large house. We were there the last time we went to the mountains.
Were you able to continue to live in that larger house through the Depression, or how did your life change? Do you remember?
Well, we didn't own the house on Farwood. We rented it, and we lived there for a good part of the years during the Depression. By the time I was in junior high, though, I think we had moved to an apartment on Merriman, which was 2 doors from the fire station and a half a block from the grammar school. But by that time, I was not in the elementary school. I was at junior high, and we moved there. And if I remember right, we moved because somebody bought the house that we'd been renting all these years. And I can remember a debate. My mother felt like we should buy the house, and my father thought $3,500 was too much for that house. I was about 10 in this picture, Zach, and I would guess that I was born in 26. This would have made this be 36, and right in the middle of the Depression. And that, of course, colored most of my life, was the fact that I grew up in the Depression and saw how people suffered economically. I never went without anything to eat or something to wear, but I was aware, very conscious in school, that we constantly had clothing drives for children whose parents or fathers were unemployed. In those days, very few mothers worked, but the fathers were unemployed, and there was no welfare as we know it today, and they would take any kind of odd jobs they could get. But we were constantly having food drives and clothing drives for the children of these people who were unemployed. And businesses were closed all over town. A lot of people lost everything that they had. Banks closed. People lost all their money that they had in banks because the banks failed. The only bank in Asheville that never closed was the Wachovia Bank, which belonged to R.J. Reynolds. And R.J. Reynolds was so financially secure that his banks went through the Depression without ever closing or creating it. And that's one of the reasons they became such a giant bank. People had great respect for them. In this picture, Zach, I must be about maybe 15 or 16, either just started Emory or just finished up at Boys High. If you notice, we wore long collars and stripedy ties.
What did you do for fun during high school, and what was the situation with dating and girls like for you?
Well, it was a whole nother world then, Zach. The Jewish community in Atlanta, and we were living in Atlanta then, was very active socially. We had 3 major clubs here, the Mayfair Club, the Standard Club, and the Progressive Club. And people dated a lot. Very often on a weekend, you could have 2 or 3 different dates with different girls. You go out with somebody Friday night, and somebody on Saturday night, and somebody else on Sunday or Sunday lunch. We didn't go like people do today, go with a girl all the time. Sometimes there would be a girl that you'd see more frequently than others. We had a lot of clubs in those days. I belonged to a club with another group of boys, and we kind of went around with a bunch of girls who belonged to a club. You know some of the girls that were in that club. Your Aunt Charlotte was in that club, Barbara Moldo, Jane Adair, Rigolda Jacob, and Rigolda Stein. These girls were all in that club, and strangely enough, those girls have stuck together and remained very close friends all these years. I'm still friendly with a lot of the boys that I was in the club with, but we're not close friends anymore. We've drifted apart. It's interesting. I guess because the girls make most of the social lives, they can hold a group together.
What kind of stuff would you do on these dates? Like Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday afternoon?
Well, of course, a lot of them had to be rather inexpensive dates, but in those days, we would go to the midnight show at the Fox because I worked in the daytime on Saturday, and we usually didn't get off work till 10:30, 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. We'd go to work before the store opened. I'd sell shoes, and the store wouldn't close till 9, and then we had to straighten out the stock and put the trash out, and I would get $2.50, $3 for that day's work. And then I would go and pick up my date, and we'd go to the midnight show at the Fox, and I think it cost $0.25 to get into the movie in those days. And sometimes we'd go to the Varsity before that, and hot dogs were a nickel, and hamburgers were a nickel. And a carload could go there for $1. So our dates weren't really expensive. There were a lot of hay rides and things of that type.
Did you have your own car?
This is a group of us. These are my friends. They're in my club. And I think, if I can remember correctly, we were all dressed and ready to go to somebody's Sweet 16 party. It was traditional then that each of the girls would have a big dance with a band for Sweet 16 at their 16th birthday. And we had one of these go almost every week, all fall and winter long. So it was an important part of our social lives in those days.
So I had asked if you had a car because you said you'd pick up your date. How did you get around?
Oh, we all had to mooch cars from our parents. The first one of our whole crowd to ever have a car was Stanford Mackover, and he got a car in 1941. His parents, he graduated from high school. His parents bought him a yellow Plymouth convertible. And we could get 8 people in that convertible without a bit of trouble.
That was before seatbelts.
But the rest of us all had to mooch cars from our parents. Some few families had 2 cars, and their cars were always one of them available on the weekends. The rest of us, we just had to kind of arrange our social lives around automobile availabilities. The year before we relocated to Atlanta, while we were still living in Asheville, and I was in junior high school, I was very active in the school, and was editor-in-chief of the school newspaper and on the patrol, and I think I was vice president of the student body. I was a big man on the campus at junior high school. Of course, by the time when I got to Atlanta and went to Boys High, there were a lot of really big men on the campus, and I was just a small man on the campus. I never really was very active in school things. I think these things happen to you in schools that you have been in grammar schools together and junior high schools together, and when you get to high schools, the leaderships have already formulated, and it would be very hard for anybody to break in and be a key player on a transfer basis. And when I was about 17 and World War II had already started, and my friends, who most of whom were a year or two older than I, had already, a lot of them, gone into service, I became very aware that ultimately I was going to have to be in the armed services, and giving it careful thought. I hated the idea of being shot at, but the idea of having to walk with a big heavy pack on my back a long way to get shot at did not appeal to me slightly. So I tried to enlist in first the Navy Air Corps, the Naval Air Forces, and had to get together a whole group of reference letters and transcripts of grades so that I could apply before they'd even give me a physical. And then when I took the physical, they discovered my depth perception didn't qualify me to be a naval aviator, and they respectfully told me, go find a job somewhere else. And because the Naval Air Force decided that they didn't need me, I decided I still didn't want to go walking a long way to get shot at, so I enlisted in the Army Air Corps, which later became the Army Air Force. And picture was taken, I guess, at the completion of my basic training. I'm really not sure exactly. It was early in my military career. And I did not qualify to go to pilot school when they tested me. So the Navy wasn't totally wrong. And I became an aerial gunnery instructor and was assigned to a combat crew training station where we trained B-24 crews as 10-man crews prior to their being sent into the combat theaters. They'd come from their various schools, the pilots from their school, the navigators, the radio people, the armorers, would come from their various schools, and we would get them and form them into 10-man crews and train them for about 12 to 13 weeks prior to them going into combat theaters. Okay, you ready? This was taken while I was in the Air Force, and most of these pictures were taken at Tonopah, Nevada, which is the training base I was at. And the picture on the lower left is Jack Preston and I, who was my best friend in service. And on the other side were three of my other really good friends, and who I have kept in touch with off and on over the years and kept up with for many years.
So tell us about when you two met.
Well, my first memory of meeting your mother was at a fraternity party, an A-Phi fraternity party at Emory. One of my roommates, Ike Drazen, brought Adele to the party, and I met her. It was interesting, when I met her, I found that I had known her brother for many years. Matter of fact, he and I had worked at the grill at the Progressive Club swimming pool in 1940 together. I never knew he had a sister. Maybe he didn't like my reputation, didn't want me to know his sister, or maybe she was just too young for me to know at that stage. But that's where I first remember meeting her.
And do you remember what you thought of her when you first met her?
I thought she was kind of cute, and she was blonde and petite, and she kind of fit my description of the ideal woman. Then I found out she had a maid that was a marvelous cook. And that was a major, after eating the fraternity house for a year or two, that was a very important thing. But then I did have a car, so I could get across town from Emory to Grant Park. And that's how it always started.
And how did you remember first meeting Lenny?
Well, I remember the first time I saw him was walking up the steps of the Fox Theater, going to the ballroom to I think it must have been an interfraternity council dance, and I had a date with Ike Drazen or somebody, and I saw this really handsome guy in front of me, and I really liked the way he looked. And so during the evening, I made a point to meet him, and he was a real hunk. And then at another time, when I went to a fraternity party, I talked to him, and we danced and got to know each other a little bit, and then he asked me for a date, and I went.
So, Dad, you said Mom was your sort of idea of an ideal woman. Can you tell me more about what you liked about her and why you went out with her on another date after that first date?
Well, she was fun, and she was interesting, and she was cute, and she had a nice figure, and all the things that appeal to young boys she had, so she appealed to me.
And Mom, you said, you sounds like you picked Dad out before he even noticed you. But after you got to know him, what was it about him that you liked besides the fact that he was a hunk?
Well, I like that too, but he was really very nice and thoughtful, and we had fun together, I think, most of the time. And we seemed to enjoy doing the same things, and he used to work on Saturday, and he would come to my house after work, and we'd have dinner, and then we'd go wherever we wanted to go. We went to parties, mostly fraternity parties, and there were hay rides in the wintertime, and they were fun. And we just seemed to hit it off, and I would go to Emory, and they had an intramural football game, and watch him play football. And we just seemed to enjoy each other's company, I think. He was still a hunk, though.
This is from my annual 1948 at Emory. That was the year that I was president of AE Pi, Alpha Epsilon Pi. Was an interesting period of my life. I met a lot of really good people, nice friends, lifelong friends. As it happened, on my birthday, we had a surprise party for me at the fraternity house. And Adele was there with my roommate, Ike Drazen. And that's when I really remembered us starting to go out together.
So you had gone to her house to eat dinner, if nothing else. Do you remember how her mother felt about you?
Her mother was a very warm, welcoming person. She never treated anybody other than nicely. I don't ever remember her not being pleasant to anybody that came in the house, other than, of course, her daughter. She gave her fits sometimes, but she always was very sweet and very nice to me. In the 1948 Emory annual, there is a picture of the first time I really became conscious of Adele and conscious that I could be interested in her. And while she wasn't my date at this birthday party at the fraternity house, she came with Ike Drazen, who was at the furthest left. And I think that's when I really became interested in her, was at that particular time and at that particular party. The other fellows in the picture are Jerry Epstein and Norman Diamond and Gene Somberg, and the fellow on the left was Ike Drazen, and that's me in the middle with a sleeveless sweater on. And I don't remember who my date was.
Do you remember taking Mom to meet your family? Or was that a big decision to introduce her to your family?
No, I don't think that was a big decision. I think it just happened in a natural course of events. Either they were in Atlanta or we went to Columbus. I don't remember it being any big deal. Do you?
No, but it was much further along in our relationship. I was about 17 or 18, I think, when this picture was taken. It was after I had graduated high school, and possibly could have been my graduation picture. And at that time, I was probably working. I had decided not to go to college because I graduated in January, and I was going to go away the following September. So I was working at that time and really had a great time just working and not having the responsibility of studying. And I hadn't met Daddy at that time. I met him probably the following year. after I had come back from the University of Georgia and met him at a fraternity party.
But you can see how she looked in this picture at that age. Why, I might have become interested when I did meet her and realized that Milton had a little sister. My goodness, how did that happen?
This was a picture that was taken at Dorothy Feinberg's wedding, and Daddy and I were mutual friends with her. He had dated her during college. I had grown up with her. In fact, her mother and father were friends with my mother and father when I was a small child. And we were in this wedding together, and we happened to be in a lot of weddings together.
And that's how I got trapped into getting married. She told me to come to the Mayfair Club in a white dinner jacket. We're going to be in a wedding. When I got there, I found out it was ours. And there I am in my white dinner jacket with my lovely bride. And I guess maybe I was a little bit suspicious that maybe it was us getting married before I went. But this is a family picture of my father and mother on my right, and Deli and I in the middle, and Nanny and Uncle Milton on the other side. And so this was a family picture taken at the Mayfair Club when we got married. It was in September, wasn't it, or do you think it was July?
September 4th, 1949. It was Labor Day weekend. And there's a joke about July because about a year after we were married, we were at a party and someone had asked me when our anniversary was, and I said July 4th. And Lenny looked at me and he says, maybe you got married in July, but I got married in September.
So tell us a little bit about your wedding ceremony and who else was in the wedding party.
Well, most of these, the men in this, other than Uncle Milton, were fraternity brothers of mine. On the far side to my right was Ike Drazen, and then Jerry Epstein, and then Uncle Jack, and my father, and Howard Aronin, and then Milton on the end. And Dolly, tell her who the girls are.
Okay, the girls are Patsy Wyman on my right, and then Shirley Goff, and then Lenny and I, and there's Aunt Charlotte, and Carolyn Gold, and Edith Sharda at that time. She's now Edith Gordon. And the wedding was at the Mayfair Club.
And Rabbi Epstein married us. I finally forgave him for it last year.
Do you remember how many guests you had?
Thousands.
No, there weren't thousands. There were a lot of guests, but there were a lot of Lenny's parents' friends and my mother's friends and our friends and all the family. And it was a ballroom full of people.
It was about 200, 250 people. It just seemed like thousands.
So do you remember how you felt standing under the chuppah?
Well, I think it was a feeling, a surreal feeling. Is this really happening? Am I really getting married? I'm too young to get married, but she's way too young to be married. What are we doing here?
So how old were you when you got married?
I was 23.
And I was 19, almost 20. 2 weeks I was going to be 20.
So now looking back on that, do you think you were too young to get married?
Well, if we hadn't gotten married then, you would have been in trouble.
That is not true. Very handsome couple.
Yeah, so you see how young we were? I don't know how we managed to stick together all these years.
That's because we were such a handsome couple.
And we did make pretty children. look at the great-looking grandchildren we got out of this. Yeah, the dividends were pretty good.
So a year ago in September, we celebrated your 50th wedding anniversary, and the family got you a beautiful anniversary ketubah and so on. And I wonder if you could tell us, what is the secret of your marriage lasting for what has now been 51 years?
Well, we didn't get separated, I guess. That was the real secret. No, I think it was because we were committed, and we really still do love each other, and we want to be together. And I travel a lot, so she could stand it better.
Well, I think as you get older, your relationship just matures, and you go through good times and bad times, and fortunately there are more good times than there are bad times, and you have to work at working things out. And I think we did that. And we still like each other a lot. We enjoy being together and going on trips together. We like doing things for our grandchildren and our children. And I think we think alike in most ways.
So do you still think he's a hunk?
He's a hucky now. It's just more of him.
And you have 5 children, most of whom are currently married. Do you have any advice for us about marriage?
Well, I think you just have to recognize that it's not all peaches and cream. You're going to go through some rough spots and some difficult things, and there are going to be some tragedies, and there's going to be problems as well as good times, and you just have to understand that's part of living, and you go forward with it, and if you're committed to each other, you handle these problems regardless of what they are. And that's about all the advice I can give you.
Well, I think the important thing really is that you have to not ever stop working at being happy. And I think you have to be able to communicate with each other, and you have to know when something's bothering the other one, and you learn to recognize those things. And, it doesn't make any difference how much you love somebody. There's still going to be times when you're going to think, things are just not right. And you're going to have to work at them. And the love continues. Just because you're not always agreeable doesn't mean that things don't work out. And I think we've worked at it all these years, and now we're enjoying the benefits of not having to work at it so hard anymore.
So tell us about the early years of your marriage, where you lived and stuff.
Well, when we first got married, I was traveling. I had a job traveling 7 states, trying to sell furniture to retail stores. And we lived really with Nanny during that period. Mother traveled with me. We had an extended honeymoon trip all through Mississippi, Louisiana. It lasted quite a while. Then later, became very evident with the proximity of a family starting that my traveling 7 states, and then they wanted me to give me 2 more and make it 9. It wouldn't work out. It would not be satisfactory.
So what did you do?
So we ended up going to Columbus, Georgia, where my parents were, and opening a store there. And we lived in a duplex. We lived in an apartment first, which we rented for, what was it, $70 a month, some such amount. Nice 2-bedroom apartment upstairs. And then we later moved into a duplex, which was owned by your mother-in-law's mother. And she lived on one side of it, and we lived on the other side, and we lived there for year or two, and then we built a house.
And this picture was taken in the duplex. After we had moved into the duplex. I was pregnant with you, Carla. And Daddy was pretty strong still. You see I'm sitting on his lap.
And in the background is my father, back in the corner.
So you said you had an extended honeymoon. How did your life change when you became parents?
Well, it changed a lot because we had the responsibility of having children. And I had been working in the store with Daddy, and when you were born, I became a full-time mother. And fortunately, Daddy was not traveling at that time, and we enjoyed being a family.
And this is Carla, at the age of maybe 3 months. She was really a pretty child. I remember that my father always wore Countess Mara ties, but when Carla was born, they stopped being Countess Mara and were Carla Michalove ties with the CM embroidered on them. And this picture was about 2 years later, and Barbara made her appearance. And Barbara was an interesting child. She had a colic, and she could be counted on to scream loudly from about 7 every evening till about 9. And no matter what you did, if you walked her or rocked her or rolled her or what you did, she complained loudly that she did have a good set of lungs. Unfortunately, she did outgrow that, or we may have only had 2 children.
So you had 2 girls, and then you got a boy. How was that different?
It was great. We wanted a boy, and we were just lucky that he came along. You were already 6, and Barbara was 4, and along came Brad. And he was a really good baby. I just remember when he was about 4 months old, he got the mumps. And I had never heard of a baby that young getting the mumps. But we did a lot of rocking and a lot of taking care of him. Plus, when he was first born, we had to take him back to the hospital for surgery. And it was the worst feeling in the whole world when you give your baby to a nurse and then you're not allowed to sit and hold them or do anything. And the only thing we could do was wait in the waiting room while all this surgery and everything took place. And it's just awful. Fortunately, they don't do that anymore. They let the mother stay with the child. That was a terrible feeling.
So where were you living at the time this picture was taken?
We were living on Poplar Grove Drive when that picture, when Brad was born. And Daddy had already gone into the retail children's business in Atlanta. We had moved from Columbus to Atlanta, and he was in the retail children's business at that time.
Did you used to bring clothes home for us from your retail children's business?
You know we did. We used to dress you up like little fashion plates. And we would take you out and show you off.
So your family kept growing.
Well, if you look and see how pretty your mother was, you could see why we kept having children. I just couldn't leave her alone, I guess.
So can you tell us a little bit about each of the children in this picture?
Well, of course, each of you were such distinctive personalities. You, as is normal with the oldest child, you thought you were the assistant mother, and you liked to boss the other kids around a whole lot. Until Barbara, I guess, I got to be about 7 or 8, and finally told you, no when you told her to do something and let you know that she no longer was going to serve you. But each of you had your totally different type personalities. You don't, to me, look much alike, although you and Amy look more alike than the other children do, I think. Mother says that Brad looks like Uncle Milton, and I think perhaps he does a little bit. I don't know who Barbara looks like. The guy that fixed the TV set, maybe, I don't know.
And what about Amy?
Well, Amy, no question that you and Amy belong to us. I mean, you're Michaloves. You look like Michaloves.
You used to think Amy was a little doll, and you and Barbara would dress her up and play with her like she was just a live doll. You'd comb her hair and do all kinds of things with her. She would tolerate it, and you did the same thing with Brad. We have movies of you chasing Brad and helping him walk and doing all kinds of what 18-month-old babies do.
Sit down, sorry. Now you see our family complete. Stephen had finally made his entrance, and we all got dressed up and went to Linda's first wedding. And Barbara and Carla were bridesmaids, and Steve and Amy and Brad and I went to the wedding. And Mother still looked pretty good. Most people didn't believe it.
Well, I want to ask, because I know that until Amy came along, we all lived on Poplar Grove, and then we started moving. So why don't you talk about where we moved?
Well, when Brad was born, the house became a little crowded on Poplar Grove Drive, and we bought our larger house on Wesley Parkway near Aunt Charlotte and Uncle Milton. And when Amy was about, I think Amy was born on Poplar Grove Drive, and when she was about 18 months old, we moved to Wesley Parkway, and we lived in that house for 9 years. Stephen was born in that house, and you all went to Margaret Mitchell Elementary School. And it was a very, very nice time in our life. Daddy was in the manufacturing business at that time, manufactured children's clothing, and all these little babies and little people we had at home were well dressed still, and we all kept very busy.
And then, Dad, at some point you made a big decision after living in the South all your life. So do you want to tell us where we went and where this picture was taken?
Well, we relocated the family, tried to become Yankees in Massachusetts. And we bought a house in Swampscott, Massachusetts. And you had gone ahead of us, a year ahead of us moving up, and gone to school at Brandeis. And I think you still thought we moved up there to keep an eye on you. But we did relocate there. And the picture we're looking at now was taken at your graduation from Brandeis. We were all there, the whole crowd of us. By that time, I had lost most of my hair, but Steve and Brad sure made up for it on the masculine side of the family, particularly Brad. But Steve had long hair too.
Did you like Brad having that long hair?
I didn't object to it. I kidded him about it a lot, but it really didn't bother me. If it had bothered me about long hair, I wouldn't have allowed Stevens to get that long. He was little enough I could really do something about it, but I didn't.
So this is the time when you started, all your children were moving into adolescence, and it was a very turbulent time in American history as well. What do you remember about how our family life changed in the late 60s?
Well, when we moved to Massachusetts, our lifestyle changed dramatically. We'd always had a live-on, full-time maid. We all had to learn to pick up our clothes and put things in the laundry and do chores. Mother organized everybody, had their responsibilities and things that they had to do because we didn't have that type of a living situation. Living in New England was interesting, at least for about 9 months of the year. There were 3 months that I really felt like they needed me in Puerto Rico and in Tennessee and in North Carolina, where it was still green. And I think it probably was an excellent place for children to grow up. There's so much that happens in that Boston area to stimulate people's interest and broaden their vistas. I think it was a chance for each of you to learn that you could stand on your own feet. You weren't in a community where you were somebody's children. And I think it was a healthy thing.
Do you remember having any conflicts with any of us as teenagers?
Oh, lots. People always have conflicts with teenagers. That's part of being teenagers. Barbara used to drag home some of the scrawniest guys that I couldn't imagine. You were much involved with this anti-Vietnam mess. Having been raised in another era, I just felt it was awful that people were so involved in anti-war activities and things that I considered not patriotic.
I think we were mostly concerned at that time with drugs because they were really very prevalent at that time, and neither one of us, to my knowledge, had ever used any drugs, and there were so many things going on. Even Amy's friends, would come to our house and sit on the steps and cry, and she'd come and get me and didn't know what to do with them, and we were so concerned, and we tried to keep a close eye on all of you as much as we could, but you were already in college and we didn't know what you were doing half the time till after it was done. Then you would tell us, you took off with somebody to Washington on a motorcycle, or then you'd bring another friend home. But we always felt that as long as you felt that you could come home with anybody, with anything, and you would always be welcome there. And hopefully y'all all felt the same way, and because you kept showing up.
And I know at that time you got involved in doing some things with the youth group as well, so it wasn't just your teenagers you were concerned about. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, we worked with the junior youth group at the Temple, and when we moved to Lexington, and we enjoyed it while we were there, and we took them skiing, and we had all kinds of different meetings and parties, and we really enjoyed doing it. We did it for a year, and at that particular time, Amy was in that age group, and she didn't even object to us being the leaders of the group, which was nice.
It was convenient to have a swimming pool in the backyard because it was a good place to have the kids. And it worked out nicely.
So being the breadwinner in this growing family was a big part of your life. And you told us that you started working for your grandfather when you were 6 or 7 years old. So can you talk a little bit about the work and business aspects of your life?
Well, I don't know I can tell you much about the business ethics. I was raised in an environment where you tried to be as fair and honest with people as you could and tried to deliver the services that you were supposed to. And I've kind of followed that and encourage you to follow that along. I don't think you have to take advantage of anybody. to further yourself. After Mother and I got married, and found that being a traveling salesman really didn't agree with me, because I really wanted to be home. I wanted to be at home with her and with the children. We then went into the retail business. And retailing was fine during the busy periods of the year, but there were the dull, dead times that made the days seem like they were interminable. And ultimately, after moving back to Atlanta and having a children's shop and then opening another one, and Mother, as usual, was pregnant, but Leonard Bach and Leonard and I had kind of grown up as neighbors, next door neighbors, when I was a kid and he was a kid in high school. And he had a lady shop and we had children's shop in West End next door to each other. Both of us decided we really didn't like the retail business, and we decided we would try to get into the manufacturing end of the business. And we didn't know that you had to know something about manufacturing, and we didn't know you really had to have enough capital to run a business like that, but the timing was just right for the baby boom, and we were making baby clothes, and somehow or another we were managed to get it done, and we got the kind of banking connections that people would lend us money because they had faith in us, not because we had such great balance sheets. You couldn't do that in today's world. Banking has changed so, and the banking authorities are on the bankers' necks, and you don't really deal one-on-one. But we were dealing with an executive vice president of what Fulton National Bank became Bank South, which became something else along the line. But those days, we were dealing right at the top in that bank, and he thought we were decent people, and he fully expected we were going to pay off the loans we got, and he gave us a line of credit. As I look back on it, it was unbelievable that they gave us that kind of financing, because we sure didn't have the financial strength to justify it. It was on faith, but it worked. And we operated that for a number of years, and things went along pretty well. And then we, like other people, we expanded. We bought another company, which turned out to be not the best thing we could have done. Got us into a lot of financial hot water, and ended up, at the time, everybody was becoming part of a conglomerate. And Leonard had had some heart problems, and his wife wanted him to retire. He didn't realize it, and she didn't realize it, and I didn't realize it. There was no way he could retire, but we thought he wanted to do that, so we sold the business and became part of a conglomerate. We merged our company into the BVD company, which at that time was, in today's world, not such a big company, but for us, we thought it was a big company. When we became part of that company, we were doing like $100 million worth of business. Of course, now people talking hundreds of billions. And later, that company was sold to a larger conglomerate called Rapid America, which was headed up by one of the fabulous financiers of the era, Michalove. And after we did the merger with BVD, Leonard did get out of the business, and I continued and managed it on contract. And with all the changes that came about, I became somewhat unhappy with the direction of the way things were going. Things that I felt like we needed to do, I couldn't do because they were spending money for something else. I wanted to do an expansion move, but we couldn't do that because one of the other companies was going to buy a mill in Scotland. Well, that had no connection whatsoever to me, but it did rankle. I was used to doing what I wanted to do when I wanted to do it. So I decided to leave, and I did. I went with Hampshire Designers, which was a producer of unbranded hosiery at that stage, having sold the brand that this old mill had once had to Burlington Industries, and had another division that made ladies branded sweaters. I was in the hosiery end of the business. It was headquartered in Manchester, New Hampshire. The chairman of the board of our company was the founder of the company. He was in his 80s, was a remarkable old man who really was right with it all the way along the line. And his son was president of our company, was also chairman of the board of Tootsie Roll. He'd married a girl whose father had gotten control of Tootsie Roll, which is a very old company, because during the Depression, her father was a manufacturer of cardboard cartons, and when the people who owned Tootsie Roll couldn't pay for the cartons they had bought from him, they offered him the company, and he took it. His name was Bill Rubin, and Bill Rubin had had a stroke, and there were no other males in this family. It was Ellen and her sister, and Mel, who was Harvard Business School and what have you, became chairman of the board of Tootsie Roll, and he and Ellen still run Tootsie Roll to this day, and done a hell of a job with it. But at any rate, I worked for them for a number of years, and it was interesting. We took the company public at that time. It was an experience. It was an experience, number one, to try to run a public company that had been a family business where everybody had lived and expensed everything out through the business. And I constantly had to battle about, well, you know, fellas, we got stockholders. We sold stock to other people. You took your $16 million out, and you give up the ability to have your chauffeur and your maid and all these people on the payroll. And it was a turmoil that went on that got to be a bit much after a while. And after about 5 years of that, I decided to try something else. Then we moved back south to Charlotte, North Carolina. And went in the double knit business and the knitting business. And the world decided that double knit was no good after being the favorite thing in the whole world. The timing couldn't have been worse. The idea was good, but the time was wrong. So we ended up coming back to Atlanta and selling that company to a company out of Mississippi and moving all the production to the Dominican Republic.
So when you came back to Atlanta, you came back home professionally as well as where you were living.
Oh, yeah.
In what way?
Well, we because we were making all of our merchandise in the Dominican Republic, we were operating under Title 807 of the import laws, and we only had to pay duty on the stuff that of the value added. So we had a cutting operation, and we shipped the goods to the Dominican Republic to be sewn, and then brought it back into this country, paid the duty, and shipped it. And that was the way the company was structured. We had, when we originally set the company up, we had a dye house in Monroe, North Carolina, so we actually dyed our own garments. But and when we moved to Atlanta, we used normal type fabrics, piece goods and woven goods, as well as knit goods. And we functioned with that for several years. It wasn't particularly successful. We didn't starve. We didn't do without anything, but it was not financially rewarding. And after I left that, the people that BVD had chosen to run Fawn, which was the company that Leonard and I had started, were not doing too well with it, and it was in trouble. And the executive of that company, who it reported to, came to me with the idea of perhaps taking back the management of it and see if we could resurrect the company. And I worked with them for about a year, and we had built the company back somewhat and reestablished a position in the marketplace, which they had pretty well lost. And along with Mal Mayer, who was an old friend from Asheville even, ended up buying the company back from Rapid America, and we operated it for several years. and the label was going pretty well, but it became very obvious that trying to produce children's wear in the United States was not going to be feasible. The labor cost here was so high compared to what could be had in the Philippines and the Orient and what have you, that we made a decision to sell that, and we did. We sold it to an outfit in South Georgia who was primarily a manufacturer for pennies, and who was a little nervous because most of his business was pennies, and he liked the idea of getting into branded goods. But turned out we were right. It was beyond doing to continue operating in that manner. Either you became an importer and set up to manufacture goods in the Orient, or you were not going to be able to compete. And after we sold that, interesting enough, Leonard Bach had bought an infants wear company, which they got into some problems with, and he asked me to see if I could work with him as a consultant to help him straighten out his manufacturing. Well, it turned out he thought all the problems were in manufacturing, but once we straightened them out, we found that there just was no way to cost efficiently compete in that marketplace without making your goods either in, well, you could do it perhaps in the Dominican Republic or Mexico or the Orient, but it would require some major additional capitalization. And Leonard's partners at that time felt like they had made a mistake and just wanted out, and we together made a decision. There was no future for anybody there, and we closed that company. It was called Toddle Tyke. You may know some of the people from that business, Russell Harris, Buddy Harris, Mike Kraft. They had started a children's wear company that they had bought from another old friend of ours, whose name was Sophie Wolfson. And it was a very small little community. Everybody knew everybody, and we were arch competitors, but if they were short 1,000 yards of white broadcloth and needed it badly, they would call us and I would lend it to them. It was not that kind of a nasty competition.
Well, you know, you said you were, it was like a small little family. At various times, different members of your personal family came to work with you. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, when Brad got out of school, he came to work with me. He'd gone to FIT, as you know, the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, which we used to kid him, tell him was Fags in Training was the real name of that school, because about half the guys at that school were gay, and a lot of gay people in the fashion industry. It never bothered me to work with them, and I found some very talented people to work with. But Brad came to work with me. But we were fighting, really at that stage, a losing battle. We just couldn't compete with the foreign competition. And no matter what we did, it couldn't be real right, it only could be fair. And of course, then Brad came up with this testicular cancer. And it was a bad scene, it was a bad episode in our lives at that time, both business and personally. We were all very concerned about Brad. Fortunately, he went through all this treatment, and it's been clean ever since. Of all the cancers that people can have, testicular cancer, they've had the most success in treating. You know, it's interesting that it is, but he's been cancer-free all these years since.
You were talking about how difficult the experience with Brad's illness was, which brings me to this question. What has been the most difficult experience in your life?
Carla, I can't pin down what any particular thing has been. That was certainly ranked right up amongst the top. when I decided that what I was doing in North Carolina was not going to work. That was a difficult period to find a way to bail that one out and not lose my shirt totally. That was a difficult one. There was a difficult period after I finished up, closed out Type for Leonard, and Milton was sick, and our real estate investments were not being supervised properly. Taking over that responsibility for those. At that stage, we had 3 apartment complexes and 2 motels. And the motels I never did want to be involved with. Milton was rather headstrong, and I recognize it because I'm the same way. And sometimes we made up our minds we're going to do something. We did it. And being a partner in it and on the notes and what have you, well, I was involved, although something that I would have voted against had I had a vote. So I had that, and I could see Milton declining. And as you know, we'd been very close over the years, going back to summer of 1940 when we ran a grill at the Progressive Club. So that we had a very close relationship. And this is Dellie's brother, for those of you who don't remember Uncle Milton. And he was very sick. He was had scleroderma, but he wouldn't admit that he was failing, but he was, both physically and mentally. He just wasn't functioning well. The motel business at that stage got to be very difficult. The town was overbuilt. We were all cutting prices. The only thing that you can't afford to do in the hotel-motel business is have empty rooms. You cannot inventory them. If you don't rent them today, you've lost that rent. And he's got very competitive and got to be very difficult business. But fortunately, we were able to sell them finally and get out from under them.
What would you say has been the most rewarding experience?
Well, I think when we built Fawn initially, starting in the 50s, and start from, mainly because everybody said, you can't do that. I remember walking into a thing of some people that I'd gone to school with, and one fellow was telling the other fellow, last year, Leonard and Lenny did $1 million worth of business. And the other guy says, hell, they don't have enough capital to do $1 million worth of business, but we did. They didn't know we had a bank that had a lot of capital.
Is there something that you've always wanted to do that you haven't had a chance to do yet?
Oh no, I've touched most of the bases, I think, Carla. There are a lot of things that I wish I'd done better. I think I've only worked maybe to 60% of the things that I really had the ability to do. And some of them I regret not having done them better and assuming a greater role in some things. But no, I think I've touched most of my bases.
What do you think is the most serious problem in the world today?
I think it probably is attitude. People are so convinced that everything that happens to them is somebody else's fault, that somebody else is responsible, and they will not accept the responsibility for their actions. And if somebody falls on a sidewalk, they try to decide who's got the most money. That's who I'll sue. It's their fault, not because they stumbled on the curb or they were careless. We are so litigious that it's a shame the cost that we have to bear and everything that we buy for the insurance that people have to carry to protect themselves from all of these phony blackmail lawsuits. And a case in point is this thing with Coca-Cola paying $192 million in blackmail to these black people. Some of them may have been discriminated against, but many of them simply weren't capable of doing any better than what they did at Coca-Cola. And now I'm seeing the same thing happening at Delta. Here they are, the same law firm is suing Delta, and this is just locally. It's happening all over this country, and I'm afraid maybe all over the world. I don't know.
What do you think is the most important thing in your life?
Zach, I think family is the most important thing that any of us have in our lives. And nothing should ever put you in a position where you'll cut yourself off from your siblings or your parents or your children when you have children. But nothing that any of them can ever do can be important enough that you cut yourself off from them. And you're going to disagree within a family, within your friends, but the one thing you can always count on are your family. They don't know.
What are your hopes and wishes for your grandchildren and your children?
Well, I think that the primary wishes that I have for my children, my grandchildren, is number one, I hope they have good health. I hope they have good luck. I hope they'll be true to themselves and to their families. And I think with that, they'll be happy people.
Do you have a message to tell them to help them along the path of life?
Well, I think most of them pretty well know right from wrong. If they'll do right more often than they do wrong, that will move them right along the path of life. Look at Diana.